Welcome to Primetime Weekend. I'm Nicole Wallace. Let's get right to the week's top stories.
He had said something to the effect of, I don't want people to know we lost, Mark. This is embarrassing. Figure it out. We need to figure it out. I don't want people to know that we lost.
Trump knew all along, right, that he lost. Even though he has raged now for 4 years that the 2020 presidential election was somehow stolen from him. In private, even Donald Trump has admitted the truth. Even Donald Trump knows the truth. It's the truth he's so embarrassed about that President Joe Biden, he refers to him as this guy, beat him in the 2020 presidential election. Today, in a brand new tape, never heard before, we're hearing that private admission in the ex-president's own words, on tape. A remarkable slip of the mask, right? Trump's facade made during one of his half-dozen interviews with writer Ramin Sotoudeh, author of a brand new book chronicling Trump's time as host of The Apprentice. We spoke with Ramin on this program yesterday. He told us about this moment. Here is that never-before-heard exchange that came up when Trump was talking about former Fox News commentator Geraldo Rivera. Listen.
What was Geraldo like?
He was good. He did a good job.
Yeah.
He was smart, cunning. He did a good job.
And are you guys still close, or you no more?
No, I don't think so. He is. After I lost the election, I won the election, but when they said we won, he called me up 3 or 4 times. I didn't take his call because I was so busy fighting it, you know, with what went on. And we've caught him. I don't know if you see it, but you will. But he called me up 3 or 4 times. And finally I had a little time. I called him back. And he went on Fox and he started talking about the president called me. I didn't call him. I returned his phone call. And he started talking very personally about how I was feeling, how I was doing, and I said, that's really a betrayal. I didn't talk about how I was feeling. It was a phone call that lasted very quickly. Just, hey, how you doing, Geraldo? How's it going? It's not my deal. He's not my psychiatrist.
Right.
But he made it sound like it was such a big deal. It was a nothing. All I did was return his call. But he said, the president called me, like I'm reaching out to him. Yeah. And I haven't spoken to him since.
So despite Trump's efforts to put his mask back on, right, to quickly cover it up, you heard the truth pour out of him. Call me after I lost. Geraldo, I mean, I won, but he lost. He lost, he knows it, and speaking conversationally, he admitted it on tape. But meanwhile, publicly, and even there in that call, the disgraced ex-president continues to perpetuate and spread the lie that has undermined trust and faith in our elections, in American democracy, the lie that his own supporters have bought into hook, line, and sinker, some of them the cost of their freedom, their liberty. The lie that fueled the supporters into committing a deadly coup against the United States government at the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. The lie for which dozens of Trump's allies have been indicted across several states now. More than half of all Republican voters believe the lie that Trump couldn't even keep up in a taped interview. But now we know the cult leader doesn't even believe the lie. The mask slipping is where we start the hour with co-editor-in-chief of Variety, author of the new book. We showcased it here yesterday. He's back, Apprentice in Wonderland, How Donald Trump and Mark Burnett Took America Through the Looking Glass. Ramin Sotoudeh is back with us. Ramin, I loved everything about our conversation yesterday, but as a show, we have sought to really understand how the lie about Trump's defeat in 2020 has undermined voting rights. Almost 400 voter suppression bills have been passed in 48 states in this country, predicated on a lie. The January 6th insurrection happens. Mike Pence doesn't endorse Donald Trump. First time that's ever happened in our country's history. And it's such a precious piece of reporting amid many other precious pieces of reporting that even Trump let the mask slip with you and said, Geraldo called me after I lost. Just tell me what that moment was like for you sitting across from it.
We were sitting at the same table. This was in August 2021. He was very comfortable that day because we were actually watching clips of The Apprentice. And I think part of the reason why the mask slipped off was that he was remembering his life as an entertainer. He was very amused. He was excited to see himself in the boardroom. And this is all performance art for Donald Trump. My book really tries to get into the psyche of who Donald Trump is, what his motivations are, what he's doing as a politician, quote, politician, because I make the argument in the book that he's not really a politician. And the contestants I talked to said that Donald Trump is an actor. He played a role on this reality show. And as a candidate pursuing the White House, he also played a role. As President of the United States, he also played a role, and this lie that he perpetuates is also part of that role. He's acting the part of this aggrieved politician who claims that the election was stolen from him because he knows that's something his base loves. He loves to distort reality, and we, like the character in Alice in Wonderland, are going down the looking glass in this story where he's creating false narratives, distorting the truth, and confusing the American public.
Rubin, did you follow the January 6th public hearings closely at all?
I did.
I mean,
yes.
I asked that because this is part of a pattern, and what's so unique about it is everything else was a witness, right? So Cassidy Hutchinson testifies to it. Alyssa Farah testified to walking into the Oval Office to check on Trump, and that's when he's watching television and mutters, "I can't believe I lost to this guy." But you have it on tape, and I wonder, I'm going to read. To our audience, Trump's response to this part of the book and this revelation that we were going to play the tape. This is his campaign spokesperson. After recognizing the importance of The Apprentice, its significant cultural impact on a global scale, and Trump's remarkable role in forever changing the landscape of entertainment, this writer has now chosen to allow Trump derangement syndrome to rot his brain like so many other losers whose entire existence revolves around Trump. That's a campaign person. What's notable is what's not in there, right? The dog that doesn't bark. No denial that Trump knows he lost.
It's notable, and it's also part of the performance art, right? That's an outrageous, over-the-top, crazy statement that you'd expect from a reality star who engages in feuds, calls people's names, makes up names, creates false narratives. What was also interesting about this moment was that the story of why he and Geraldo had a falling out traces back to the fact that after they spoke, Geraldo went on, it was called Twitter at the time, and said the president will accept the results of the election. And Donald Trump, according to Geraldo, said a version of that to him on the phone shortly after the election, and then changed his mind and decided that this election, he was going to claim the election was stolen from him, and he was going to perpetuate that lie that we were talking about. And so that's the reason why he stopped talking to Geraldo. But it all goes back to the fact that he's playing a part. He's pretending, he's created this false narrative, and millions of people believe him.
I mean, I think you have a frame that's really instructive for anyone who's trying to cover Trump in this moment, right? Because the other mask that you take off is the idea that he ever saw himself as the leader of anything. He didn't see himself as a president. And I want to play another piece of tape that you've given to us exclusively. And this is him talking about Dennis Rodman's acumen to deal with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. Let me play this.
Dennis was a pretty cool cat in many ways, I'll tell you. Hey, look, he dated Madonna when she was the #1 person. You got to have something going, right?
He also showed up, I think, to one of the summits you had with Kim Jong-un because he knew Kim very well. Do you remember that?
So Kim Jong-un really liked him.
Yeah.
Legit.
Yeah.
And I said, I can get these guys out of Harvard government and central casting. They couldn't do anything with Kim Jong-un. A guy like Dennis could. I didn't use Dennis for it,
Right.
but I thought about it a couple of times before I got to know Kim Jong-un. But Dennis would have done a better job than your traditional people, your traditional Ivy League people that always do that stuff and they have no personality. No, Kim Jong-un liked him. He coached their basketball team.
Right.
And he did. I asked him about that. He said, I like Dennis.
You asked Kim during one of the summits.
Yeah, I asked him. He liked him. And by the way, Dennis liked him, too.
I mean, I don't even know if the looking glass does it. I mean, this is someone who murders his own people. I mean, Aquarians of Pyongyang. I mean, this is one of the most brutal dictatorships in the world. Represents a growing threat to this country with the new alliance with Putin. And Trump is so cavalier about it. He thinks Dennis is better than anyone who's studied North Korea's nuclear capabilities or understands the geopolitical impact of an alliance with Vladimir Putin. Say more about this part of your interview.
This was a very strange moment in our interview. And to me, it all traces back to Donald Trump saying that because Dennis Rodman in the 90s dated Madonna, he's, quote, a cool cat. And that is the headspace that he's in, right? It's the wanting to be in the proximity of fame, seeing fame as a currency, seeing celebrity as a currency, the ultimate currency, and having no qualifications in terms of leadership. When he says that Dennis Rodman is better than these guys from Harvard, which he calls central casting, and somehow Dennis Rodman, who was a contestant twice on The Celebrity Apprentice, dealt with being an alcoholic on the show, was known for these very messy antics on the show, somehow had a better handle on global diplomacy and dealing with Kim Jong-un than people in our government who went to Harvard, who studied what we need to do as in terms of our government, in terms of making sure that we are handling this in the professional, correct way. It was very jarring. It was very frightening. And this is what the American public need to know. This is the way in which Donald Trump handles diplomacy. This is the way in which he sees his role as President of the United States. And it's a continuation of his role as the host of The Apprentice. He is a reality show character that is conducting himself in the White House like a celebrity who's pretending to be someone else.
I mean, I've got a question for you. I mean, you had extraordinary access to Trump. You are, and if I'm wrong, I hope someone will call me directly and tell me. But you're the only person that I know of who had access to 6 taped interviews with Donald Trump after he lost the 2020 election, and it sounds like he was forthcoming. It sounds like he let you lead the conversations. If I have any of that wrong, please interject.
He did. He did. We spent a lot of time together.
What did you make of how easy it was to get to him by simply telling him, you're writing about this thing that he's more proud of than anything he did as president?
Well, that was also strange, right? And when we started these conversations, it was in May 2021. And at the time, certainly, I don't know if most people thought that Donald Trump would decide to run for president and become the nominee again after the insurrection. And he was very deflated, but it was very easy to access him. I went to Trump Tower. There was no one around. I went up the elevator. He was sitting alone in his office. He didn't seem to have a lot of people around him. He seemed very resentful, very lonely, very sad. And he wanted to devote a significant amount of time to talking to me. And in a lot of the tapes, because I went back and listened to some of these tapes as we provided you with this exclusive footage, he talks about how excited he is to be talking about The Apprentice, how much he enjoys it, how happy he is. And the reason I got so much access was because this is what he wants to talk about. He's not interested in being commander-in-chief. He's interested in reality TV.
We're less than a week away from the first presidential debate. President Joe Biden sharing a stage with the twice impeached, 4 times indicted, now criminally convicted, disgraced ex-president. What Vice President Kamala Harris is saying today about the stark contrast the Biden campaign hopes to make to everyone watching. Republicans are glitching out. They can't seem to make up their minds on how to attack President Joe Biden ahead of the debate. Who is President Biden to them, really? Is he an evil genius, a mastermind who managed to steal a presidential election without leaving behind a shred of evidence? A puppet master secretly pulling the strings of political prosecutions in New York and Georgia and everywhere else? Or is he the other thing they attack him for the other half of the time? Is he Sleepy Joe Biden, the bumbling elder statesman, not all there, somehow incapable of the most basic human interactions? On Earth One, we understand he can't be both. And of course, in reality, he's neither. But for the Republican Party, the problem with trying to have it both ways is that occasionally those two contradictory images of President Biden run up against each other. After weeks of sharing deceptively manipulated or edited videos in a concerted effort to make sure that as many people as possible think President Joe Biden is bumbling, people in Donald Trump's corner are now playing what the New York Times calls the expectations game. They're now raising the bar so that voters aren't as impressed when President Joe Biden gets the chance to speak to them directly. Meanwhile, the Biden campaign is working to communicate with its supporters, with its coalition. Vice President Kamala Harris spoke to our colleague Mika Brzezinski about what to expect in the debate.
Joe Biden and this debate will make clear the contrast. You know, of the many issues in our country and our world that are complex and nuanced, November of 2024 is binary. And when you look at the difference, I would ask people to really imagine what the world will be like on January 20th, 2025. On the one hand, you have Joe Biden, who has spent his life and career fighting for the well-being of other people, including health care. On the other hand, you have the former president who spent full time when he was president trying to get rid of the Affordable Care Act, which, if he is successful as president again, would mean over 100 million people would be stripped of health care coverage. You have, on the one hand, Joe Biden, who under his leadership, bipartisan support for the first meaningful gun safety legislation in 30 years. And on the other hand, the former president, who, when speaking of survivors of horrendous gun violence, says, get over it, and will proudly talk about how, to the NRA, about how he did nothing on the issue. And I could go on and on. I think that the debate is going to make clear the contrast between our president, the current president, who works on behalf of the American people, fights for the American people, and the former president, who pretty much spends full time fighting for himself.
Joining our coverage, chief political columnist and host of the podcast Impolitic for Puck, MSNBC national affairs analyst John Heilman's here with a great interview of your own that we'll play in a second. Founder of Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America, host of the Independent Americans podcast, Paul Rieckhoff is here. Charlie's still with us. Heilman, let me play some of your conversation with Jen O'Malley-Dillon.
Joe Biden's going to stand on that stage, and he is going to show what he showed in 2020, that he is in this for all the right reasons. He's focused on delivering for the American people, and him standing next to Donald Trump is the best way to show that. Do I think rules are going to protect the American people from whatever Donald Trump might say? Of course not. But I do think, you know, having this really be serious is what the American people want. And I think that, you know, Joe Biden every day is doing the job of being president. This is a great opportunity earlier in this cycle than ever before for the two of them to stand together and for him to talk about what he's done and what he's fighting for. And, you know, not having an audience, not having distractions, not having to worry about COVID. I think all of those things are better for the American people, and Joe Biden's going to have a great debate.
John Heilman, your thoughts?
Look, I would say that you know, the Biden campaign, Jen O'Malley-Dillon, in that interview, she hasn't done an on-the-record interview since she became chairman, really an extended one that's been recorded since she became chair, stepped back into the job that she had essentially last time, which was being Joe Biden's campaign manager. Over the course of an hour, we talked about a lot of stuff. I confronted her with a lot of the concerns and fears and worries that a lot of Democrats have right now. Because of the stakes of the election, because of some of the things they see. She was confident. She had really good answers to a lot of the questions. I think that on this debate question, the thing that I asked her, Nicole, that you and I discussed on the air the other day, which is it your expectation that the moderators are going to fact check Donald Trump in real time, or is that going to be Joe Biden's job? And if it's Joe Biden's job, how do you avoid having this debate turn into Joe Biden just doing nothing but fact checking, because we know that Donald Trump is just going to spew lies? And she conceded that that was a problem, that the torrent of lies coming out of Donald Trump's mouth was obviously a problem for the country and a problem for a candidate, but also dealing with it as a challenge. And I think that one of the things they're going to be grappling with over the course of these days, they're on Camp David, really deeply in debate camp in the days ahead between now and next Thursday, is going to be this issue. How much fact-checking does Joe Biden try to do? How much does he leave to either the moderators in real time or to the media afterwards? Because he obviously has a positive message he wants to get out. And even a lot of the contrast messaging that he wants to do could be hindered significantly if he spends too much time following, I'm sure, his instinct, which is to call out every lie that Donald Trump utters, because that could be, 94% of the things that come out of Trump's mouth.
Paul Rykoff, your thoughts?
You know, I think the Democrats always make it too complicated. And I think what Joe Biden has to do is stand up and say, you might not like me, but this guy's a whole lot worse. He needs to have plain speak. He needs to be Uncle Joe. He's going to do some storytelling, but also just remind people that there's a deep ethical character integrity contrast here. I don't think it's his job to try to fact check Donald Trump. I think it's his job to remain cool and to show leadership and to show stature and show reasonableness, because really they're talking. He's talking to two groups. He's talking to Democrats. They need to say, hey, stick with me. You may not like everything I did. Please come out and vote and come out in big numbers. And he's talking to independents. And he has to be honest with independents and say, hey, I may not be your cup of tea. You may not love me. You may not love Democrats, but I'm better than this guy who's a disaster, who's a threat to our national security, who's an indicted felon. He really has to stay above this and not try to sell every single policy talking point, because we're also talking to a lot of low information voters. He's got to go to their gut. And I think he can do that most of all by showing that he's a good man and Donald Trump is a piece of garbage.
Charlie Sykes.
Well, you know, this is going to be an immensely important, immensely influential debate, which is unfortunate because I think it's going to be a shit show. Look, substance is going to be battered. It's going to be beaten. If anybody thinks that there's going to be an intelligent discussion of policy, I think that is somewhat naive. Donald Trump is going to be up there with a fire hose of insults, interruptions, and BS. And even though his microphone will be muted, I think he's going to be trying to needle and throw Joe Biden off. Paul is right. I think that people are going to be looking at this in terms of like, okay, can we trust Joe Biden? And I think that, this is, unfortunately, I don't feel I'm going out on a limb when I say that this is going to be the worst and the dumbest presidential debate in American history. It will be neither enlightening nor ennobling, because Donald Trump is not going to be up there. He's not going to be discussing student loan debt. He's not going to be talking about healthcare policy. He doesn't know anything about these policies. He doesn't care. He will just simply be flinging things. And I understand the political necessity for Joe Biden, to exceed expectations. And I understand why he is doing it and how he needs to expose Donald Trump. But part of me also thinks that, standing up there with Donald Trump as a convicted felon and treating him as if he is, a legitimate, normal presidential contender does normalize this prospect. But it is what it is. And so, and unfortunately, we're all going to be analyzing it, not in terms of debating points. I mean, nobody's going to confuse this with the Lincoln-Douglas debates. It's not even going to be the Kennedy-Nixon debate. We're all going to be evaluating the show. Who turned in the best performance in the show? I mean, we need to keep focus on the stakes, the issues here, and how important this election is. And yet, we are now being sucked into a reality show. And Donald Trump knows how to behave during a reality show or how to misbehave. I'm only hoping that there'll be a moment in which Donald Trump's behavior is so erratic, in which he loses his cool, and that Joe Biden can turn to him and say, hey, whatever you think of me, do you really want to give this guy control of the nuclear button again? I may be old, but he's old too, and he's crazy, and you can see it with your own eyes.
Heilman, I know you've got an issue with Charlie Sykes. Go ahead.
I'm still stunned on a panel that includes me and you, Nicole, two of the most profane people I know, and Charlie Sykes, nice Charlie Sykes from Wisconsin, that it was Charlie Sykes who would say,
nice.
We use drop that profanity on the air. I'm stunned by that, number one. Number two, Charlie, the prediction of this being the dumbest, worst, most insipid, most idiotic, whatever, all those adjectives, I think you have forgotten the Republican debate in 2016 that revolved around Donald Trump and Marco Rubio talking about the sizes of their respective genitalia. No matter what you think about this debate, it won't be that bad. But the third thing I think that Charlie said on the substance. Okay, fine. All right. Yeah. Maybe. But I think the third thing, and this is, I have a lot of respect and a lot of time for the argument that that by doing this debate at all, that Joe Biden is normalizing Donald Trump, and that there was a case for them to say we will not stand on stage with Donald Trump.
Yeah.
I think the case morally, the case ethically, you could make that argument. I do think politically that if Joe Biden had decided not to debate Donald Trump, and given the frame of the election that Trump has, which is me strong, you weak, and the fact that, you know, at least in some of the, I mean, we have a very tight race here. I'll say it over and over again. I don't think anybody's really ahead, but Trump's not losing right now. And I think the Biden campaign giving Trump that stick to beat them with, that Joe Biden was too afraid of Donald Trump to debate. I think that would have been a political mistake.
There might be only one thing more alarming than what has become a near medieval siege on our country's tradition of respect for the rule of law. And it's the fact that many Americans, regrettably but understandably, have, after all these years of Trump and his allies attacking it, grown numb to it, or view it as a new norm. Maybe it's an act of self-preservation for some. Maybe it's easier to just tune it all out when Trump or one of his allies in Congress or a voice on conservative media spits out such venom toward the men and women of DOJ or the FBI. But the temptation to register the lies being told about the justice system, about the FBI, simply as white noise or politics as usual, in our view, represents as grave a threat to democracy as the lies being told themselves. As an example, consider what the disgraced convicted ex-president told the crowd in Racine, Wisconsin on Tuesday.
The outrageous charges in New York were a corrupt creation of crooked Joe Biden and his group. And they really weaponized, what they did is they weaponized the Department of Justice. They weaponized all the White House.
No, they didn't. Trump committed a crime, and the people who helped him do so, some of them went to jail, some of them received immunity. They testified, and a jury of his peers convicted him. He was held accountable by a local prosecutor who worked completely independently of the Department of Justice. Full stop. But where you or I might just dismiss this as a campaign speech, MAGA disinfo, riling up the base, as just that, Trump's supporters hear those words, accept them as fact, and with January 6th as an example, are open to acting violently. It's how Trump and his allies are today priming Trump supporters for what will be nothing less than a hostile takeover of the Department of Justice should Trump prevail in November, turning around the very instruments used to keep Trump in check into political weapons. And don't take our word for it. They're saying it out loud. Trump ally, fellow convict Steve Bannon, has been open about the plan to prosecute high-ranking DOJ officials, people like Attorney General Merrick Garland, out of what he describes as, quote, retribution. Of course, when it comes to unfounded attacks against the people serving at the top of the Department of Justice, Steve Bannon's warmongering is more like Chapter 10 in a years-long saga on this front. One could easily argue that Chapter 1 started during the Obama presidency. If you've never heard or you forgot what Fast and Furious is outside of the context of a major motion picture franchise, then you successfully avoided or forgot about that period in American history. To jog your memory, Operation Fast and Furious was an ill-fated gun tracing program related to dangerous Mexican drug cartels. The operation went wrong when a U.S. Border Patrol agent was tragically killed. 2 guns from the operation were found at the scene. Attorney General at the time, Eric Holder, provided lawmakers with thousands of pages of documents, only to become the first ever sitting cabinet official in our country's history to ever be held in contempt of Congress. Then, a 19-month DOJ IG investigation found 0 evidence that AG Holder or any of DOJ's top leaders knew of or sought to cover up the depth of the scandal. But the damage had been done. The train had left the station, as they say. A concerted breakdown of trust between conservatives, right-wing media, and our institutions, especially the Department of Justice, was set in motion. The end result, all these years later, a convicted felon, presumptive Republican Party nominee, running openly on going to war with the Department of Justice on day one if he prevails in November. It is through this wider lens, this longer view of modern political history, that we examine Trump's near daily and escalating attacks on the rule of law with our next guest. Joining our conversation, former Attorney General Eric Holder is here. Thank you so much for making time for us today.
Thanks for having me, Nicole. Didn't want to necessarily review Fast and Furious, but that's probably a good place to start this conversation.
Well, and I went back and read about it myself. I've never said this on TV, but I first read in when I had written a novel, and Chris Wallace was a friend of mine. He invited me to come on the program as a panelist to mention the book. And he said, we're talking about Fast and Furious. And I said, what's that? He said, oh, read in. Our audience is really fired up about it. And I remember Googling and reading it. And it's as good an example as any of the injection of politics, pulling the levers of congressional allies to do something that had never been done before, and then softening the terrain with conservative media and conservative activists. And I wonder what you make of what Trump's promising to do in a second term to the department that you once led.
Yeah, to a department that I once led and that I love dearly. I spent nearly 20 years of my career at the Justice Department, starting out as just a line lawyer in the Justice Department, coming out straight out of law school. And there's a tradition in the department that regardless of who is in charge politically, the department uses its power in an apolitical way. And I'm very concerned about what the former president says he's going to do. Steve Bannon says what he's going to do. And I take them at their word. And I think they've learned from the first term. They will appoint a compliant attorney general, but beyond that, they now understand that they will have a compliant deputy attorney general. They will have compliant United States attorneys, and they will give these compliant U.S. attorneys hiring power so they can appoint compliant assistant United States attorneys. And they will do the things that they have said that they're going to do. Open investigations against political opponents, use the law in ways that is inconsistent with the neutral way in which the Justice Department is supposed to operate. This is something that should be, I think, a prime campaign issue. We're talking about the rule of law in this country, which really serves as the basis, the foundation for all that we hold near and dear in America.
It is the area where Trump's current advisors have spent the most time and energy on the architecture of dismantling and reassembling as a political weapon. And one of the things I know from my time in government is that other than the military, the people like yourself who've served in the Department of Justice have zero appetite for politics. And I agree with you. This should be a first, second, third issue for the voters. But how do you sort of bridge that gap between a department where the very essence of pushing back against Trumpism is to not be political, but the most effective way to reject what Trump wants to do to the department is a political solution of not voting for him? How do you bridge that gap?
Yeah, I don't think there necessarily is a gap. I mean, to say that, you're for a neutral Justice Department, that you are for democracy, that you are for the rule of law, those to me seem to be, apolitical things that can be injected into the political sphere to say, well, we have one candidate who will stand for those non-political, apolitical, pro-democracy measures. And we have on the other side a candidate who is bound and determined to subvert the system to his will, subvert the system so that his supporters and himself as well are not subject to the rules in the way that other American citizens are. I think that, people who oppose the former president have got to really kind of get over it. And understand the battlefield on which we are now operating, the terrain on which we are now operating. The normal rules in a lot of ways simply don't apply. And it means that we're going to have to be more upfront. We're going to have to be more forceful. Doesn't mean that we have to, duplicate that which they say they're going to do or use the tactics that they're going to use. But I think being just, as I said, more forceful, more open about what the dangers are. Fear is a big motivator. In 2008, Barack Obama used hope and change as a thing that galvanized huge numbers of people. I think that fear used appropriately is something that can be employed here, because the fear is of losing our democracy. The fear is of losing our freedoms. The fear is losing our ability, women's ability to make reproductive decisions. That's a fear that I think should be legitimately used by those who oppose the former president. He's certainly using fear, illegitimate fears, to try to galvanize his supporters.
I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, I think that is the frame around which the campaign must be waged, right? I mean, we can, and I think Liz Cheney articulates this. We can go back to having policy fights after the threat of Trump, and the fear of what he'd do to our democracy has abated. I wonder where you would sort of put all of the revelations. I mean, the thing that is different this time around, we were so dependent on investigative journalists in 2016 to break stories about Trump's trespasses and norm busting. It's now all on a website. I mean, it's all spilling out of his mouth somewhat incoherently. How do you break through to people who aren't paying attention, or look at it as, wow, both sides do it? You know, how do you sort of jolt people into understanding the threat that he poses to our democracy?
Well, I think that we have to use tangible examples. And it means that if it doesn't break through the first time you say it, or the second time, or the third time, you say it a fourth time. And tangible examples, and make people in the most digestible way possible familiar with what the charges are in the pending cases, make people familiar with what the results were of the case that was ultimately tried in New York City. When it comes to reproductive rights, as you've done on this show, I think very compellingly, have women come on and tell their stories. Have people come on and talk about how it's more difficult to vote in certain parts of the country. Again, having real people talk about how the things that they have done and will do will have an impact on their lives. Contextualize this in a way that makes it real for the American voter.
Switching gears for us to an urgent call by the United States Surgeon General to add warning labels to social media platforms, linking their use to damage to the mental health of teens. We'll bring you that story.
Not only have companies not demonstrated that their platforms are safe for kids, but there's growing evidence of harm. That's deeply concerning to me, not just as Surgeon General, but as a parent myself. Now, a warning label would help parents to understand these risks. Many parents don't know that those risks exist.
An urgent warning there, and a call for congressional action from the U.S. Surgeon General today for a warning label on social media platforms about how they contribute to the mental health emergency among young adults in this country. In a New York Times op-ed today, Dr. Vivek Murthy cites evidence from tobacco studies that show warning labels can increase awareness and change behavior. Quote, there is no seatbelt for parents to click, no helmet to snap in place, no assurance that trusted experts have investigated and ensured that these platforms are safe for our kids. They're just parents and their kids trying to figure it out on their own, pitted against some of the best product engineers and most well-resourced companies in the world. Joining our coverage, pediatric intensive care physician, professor of pediatrics, our old friend, Dr. Michael Anderson. You're not old, but you've been a friend of the show for a long time. It's very nice to see you. I was so happy to see this. Every parent I know struggles with this. When kids start moving around, they have devices, but it is a constant struggle to keep them off it and to monitor what they're watching on it. Weigh in.
I give Dr. Murthy such credit for this op-ed and just for the notion of a warning label. And you're right, he compares it to, we had thousands of people dying from not having their seatbelts on. Now we have seatbelt warnings. We've had thousands of people die from tobacco. Now we have tobacco warnings. I know it's a more nuanced discussion because we have to have freedom of speech, of course, but just talk to parents, talk to kids. In this op-ed, Dr. Murthy, who does a lot of town halls talking to kids, just talks of their anguish, that they don't feel good about their bodies after they're on social media. They're on an average of almost 5 hours a day, and that this is adding to the crisis that is pediatric mental health. I was honored to be a part of your program several months ago. You devoted a whole lot of time to it. it's still a crisis. And talking about social media or helping parents with social media isn't the only answer. But I think Dr. Murthy's raising some really important issues that we have to talk about.
The point about sunscreen and seatbelts and other things with warnings is so interesting because the platforms are designed and literally engineered to be addictive. And you go back and look at tobacco, it wasn't just that they found that tobacco caused cancer. A lot of the legal success hinged on the knowing addition of addictive additives.
Yeah.
And that's the parallel, right, to social media. It is being engineered for addiction. The algorithms are being engineered for stickiness. How do you at least lay on to the social media platforms as much liability as tobacco had for the addictive piece?
Yeah, I think Dr. Murthy's warning label idea is going to gain some traction. I also know there's legislation working its way through Congress now. The Kids Online Safety Act gets just at what you're talking about, Nicole. It is the algorithms. It's the incessant, perpetual scrolling. It is getting kids addicted, and the long-term mental health effects are really, really serious. So it's going to be a whole of society. It is parents asking questions, helping take control of the social media. It is pediatricians, my favorite group of professionals that deal with this on a daily basis. But boy, we also have to look to lawmakers, just like AI, just like big challenges facing our nation, to help us figure out what are the rules and regulations that have to govern this. Because Dr. Murthy ends by talking about how we protect our kids is really the moral indicator of how good a society we are.
This has been Primetime Weekend. I'm Nicole Wallace. Please tune into Deadline White House and all of our primetime shows weekdays on MSNBC.